Kia ora koutou. I'm Rose and I will be sharing a talk entitled Developing Tools for Science, a research software engineer's perspective. When I was approached to give this talk, I sort of thought about what I think makes research software engineering, our field, really cool. I think it is, for me at least, it's developing tools for scientists or for use in science. And I also thought about the kind of work I've been fortunate enough to be involved with, up to this point in my still pretty short life. And the thread for me that is sort of a commonality is surface generation and attribute mapping. And today I'm going to talk about three seemingly quite different problems or pieces of work. And I think that surface generation and attribute mapping is a thread that connects them. And as sort of Naraiha said in the introduction, I'll be kind of breaking the talk into sort of three bits, talking about medical imaging, geological modelling, and DEM generation, which I'll introduce what that actually is for flood modelling. But before I do that, I thought it might be fun to kind of have a quick background. So, and just, I don't know, hopefully it's not too much to the side, or so kind of look at where I've come, I guess, from a software perspective. So my background is electrical engineering as a bachelor's with a focus on signal processing to give a bit of maths, and then software and hardware engineering before doing a PhD in information engineering, whatever that is. And in my case, that was focused on medical imaging. And then since then, I will talk about two places I've worked. One is a research engineer at Sequent, which makes a geological modeling software. And another is both a data scientist and now a remote sensing scientist at NIWA, which is where the DEM generation for flood modeling comes into it, which I thought was kind of fun because really there's 4 or even 5 different kind of job titles or expected job titles. Obviously 2 of them are studying, which I think shows just how broad our field is and how kind of open it really is to us to sort of map our own paths through. And just to the side, I indulged looking at the sort of programming languages I was either taught in or primarily developed in. So C and Java when I was at uni, bit of MATLAB as well, MATLAB and C++ during my PhD, and more recently, actually, both other roles, primarily Python. So for medical imaging, not too long ago, but still quite a while ago, I guess starting about 10 years ago, I was doing a PhD in medical imaging, and just sort of thrown up a screenshot of the, I guess, GUI application that we use to do our research. And just give a bit of a background, given medical imaging is a large field in and to itself. So in my little bit of sort of research in medical imaging, we're focusing on fragility fractures. And by that I mean someone's walking along and they fall to the ground. So we're not talking about high impact collisions, say in a car, but low impact, low force impacts that result in a broken bone, predominantly in the elderly, and it's really when your bone is not as dense or strong as it once was, so you're more prone to these fractures. And if we look to the, I guess, left of my image, you can see at the top we've got DEXA scan. So that's basically like an X-ray, but with a little bit more information included, so you can estimate, they call it bone areal density or areal bone mass density, which is basically the integral of bone density sort of through the bone, which they've done a lot of basically population statistics to kind of look across populations and say, oh, that means you've probably got a not very dense bone, which means you're a bit more likely to suffer a fragility fracture. Given though it's an aerial measurement, that means it struggles if you've got a really small bone or a really big bone. You might actually have quite a dense bone, but it's just I guess it would be bigger in area than the population average, so it looks like it's not very dense. But that's the clinical standard currently for people, for basically inferring clinical risk of someone suffering a fragility fracture, which can have pretty life-changing impacts. Think broken hips, and really that generally ends up with poor clinical outcomes if someone's already suffered one of these fractures. I guess this slide's trying to kind of introduce the problem that I was looking to kind of contribute towards hopefully solving a little bit in my PhD research. If we look below that, you can see some CT scans, and those are basically slice profiles perpendicular through the body, and you achieve those by taking a bunch of different X-rays at a whole bunch of different like orientations, and then you do some not too complicated maths where you basically backwards model what the density would have been at any one location to create all of those slices, which, and assuming you've kind of calibrated the images correctly, you can end up with a bone mineral density at each voxel. So a voxel is like a pixel in 3D, and a CT scan is kind of like a Rubik's Cube in terms of what it looks like. Each of those voxels is like a little cube in space. So if we think about what I was sort of coming in to do, I joined a group that had pioneered a technique called cortical bone mapping, which is basically looking at profiles through the surface of a bone. If you look at the bottom of the image here, we can see a hip, and looking in profile and trying to work out how thick and how dense the cortex of the bone is, which is relevant because most of the strength in bone is in the cortex, that outer hard shell that we're all familiar with if you think of a dog bone, and measuring basically the thickness and the density of that, thickness and density across that bone. And the group I joined had pioneered that work and shown improved ability to discern whether or not, if you looked across the population, looked at scans, and then people that went on to fracture, they're able to slightly better discern who might suffer a fracture than using the 2D technique that's currently used in clinical practice. And they had a hunch basically that maybe if you look just inside that hard cortical bone layer, you might, at the intercortical surface, that might give you a little bit more information around the health of the bone, because of course bone isn't just that hard outer shell, it's also the spongy trabecular inside bit of the bone, and that's another important area that's quite hard to measure in 2D or 3D. So the sort of hypothesis basically was, if we in some way estimated or inferred properties of this intercortical surface zone, could we better discern who might suffer a fragility fracture? But before we get into that, I thought, given after all this is a research software engineer's talk, I talk about Stradwin, which is the closed source software that the research group I was joining used at that point in time. Just a few kind of, I guess, high-level facts about it. It's written in C++. In terms of the sort of GUI framework, it's WX widgets. It used OpenGL for the graphics, and it had quite a legacy stack. When I sort of went back to get the screen capture, I came across StradX, which had sort of been refactored basically from, which I think was even in a different language. And aside from WX widgets and OpenGL, it really made little use of any kind of higher level libraries. So remember, this was 2013, I was starting, and I don't know when it was ported across, but I imagine it would have been early 2000s. So anyway, I was sort of shown around the code base by my supervisor, which was awesome, and kind of had good enough of a sense to kind of think, okay, well, this is where I'll start changing the code to increase its functionality. So I could, you can see here at the bottom, there's a profile, and you can see a kind of rectangle, and look at how I could change that profile to include some sort of transitional zone for this endocortical region that we're interested in. And you can also see there's kind of up above that is somewhere where, you know, that point is measured, which is, we found was quite, the group had found was quite important for developing the software to basically make sure it was operating as expected in some areas where you could actually see what was going on, as opposed to sort of image scale or population scale validation. Anyway, there was a someone else in the group who was a postdoc, and during his PhD, he had used ITK and VTK, these two libraries that I think are originally written in C++, but at that point they had they were sort of wrapped for easy use in Python, and I think since then they've been wrapped again for other easy access and other languages. And he suggested that I at least have a look at those, as it might, even if I rewrote the entire, created basically an entire new application, it might actually be faster. So I looked into that, and it gave myself, I think, a week to see, oh, could I kind of bring up something that was kind of starting to approach what we had before in terms of at least user interaction. And I think within a month had something that, you know, for sure it didn't do everything that that Stradwin did, but did was, you know, well on its way to the functionality I needed to do my research, which I thought is an interesting thing to, certainly something I've taken away. Sometimes it's actually maybe more efficient to do whatever you're trying to do by rewriting the code. So in this case, still I wrote in C++, but used different GUI frameworks. So used Qt, which was sort of the up and coming modern framework at the time, and made extensive use of BTK and ITK, which are two, one's an image analysis library, ITK, and the other one's a great visualization library, which I'm sure many in the audience will be familiar with. So that was, but unfortunately, so I sort of asked my supervisor at the time about kind of version control and if we could open source my alternative. And at that point, he wasn't comfortable with it. So my work is on. I have since released it, but time has passed, so it's sort of in some ways been lost, as this various basically I hadn't versioned the sort of setup details, the CMake files associated with compiling. Anyway, digression for another day. If we look back a little bit more at the endocortical region, I wanted to just provide a bit of context, I guess, for the problem, because I think, at least for me, that's something that's pretty important and also fascinating. Doing research software engineering is looking at taking a bit of a dive into whatever sort of problem you're facing and understanding enough such that you can make some useful software. So I think starting on the right of this image, you can see a slightly different profile. It's no longer rectangular. Instead, we've got this transition zone, which is gives us an endocortical thickness, and we can also take the average to get a mean endocortical density. And we found basically when we included this, so we've basically measured a profile through. In this case, we used an optimizer and sort of you know, ended up with an optimal fit. We found this increased our sensitivity to our ability to discern between two populations, one that would suffer a fracture and one that would not. And I've got two more slides. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I thought I would. You can see we also had a performed population based statistics, basically, to see the significance of this approach across the population. And I mentioned discerning between people who fractured and people who did not. It's kind of skipping a step. Beforehand, we need to have some approach to validating our technique. And I think this is something that's, broader than this specific problem. This kind of holds true across any problem we might be examining. If we create tools, we need to have some way of validating them, and that requires data. So we create a synthetic data set, basically did some comparisons between the old technique and the new technique. And we also had some high resolution CT scans of cadavers who had lived their bodies to science. And again, we performed the same general approach where we compared the scan of a normal CT scan of that specimen and a high resolution one, and sort of to see the biases and errors. And I won't go into too much detail. You can basically see where it's quite dark, that means it wasn't as good. Where it's quite light, it did better. You can see there's some areas it struggles, both in synthetic data sets where it's sort of, uniform transition, and also for different bits of the body, in particular, the spine where your bone's thinner, it found it more challenging. But also these approaches were better, significantly better than in areas than the old approach. And then, of course, clinical application. I just wanted to touch on this because this is sort of the, who cares, why are we doing this? So in this case, I mentioned fracture discrimination. And I should take just a step back. One thing that was really fortunate in this work is the group I was working with had access to some quite substantial data sets of clinical data, basically. So fracture discriminations was a study, can't remember, maybe 100 to 200 individuals, and another similar amount, one set who had suffered a fracture and the other hip had been scanned, and the other set who hadn't. And this shows sort of dark is where there's a significant difference discerned using the technique. And then to the side also similar study of a smaller group of people where they received or didn't receive a particular treatment, and shows, two ways that this approach could be used to hopefully allow people to make better decisions. And just quickly, a nod to those two libraries. They're both open source. I think it was the US government maybe who sort of really got behind their development in the early 2000s, but great tools and great resources. I just wanted to come to my first concluding remarks, I guess, about this first sort of, case study. And I guess some high-level conclusions. Closed source, which was definitely stink, definitely reduced the ability for collaboration outside the little research group I was involved in. They had some top engineers, but imagine what more could be done if others could contribute directly to the code base. Also observed there's a really long lead time to clinical use for important reasons, but I think it's something that we as a society generally are going to need to grapple with if we want, as we saw, I guess, with the pandemic, if we want to improve clinical outcomes in a shorter period. First kind of note for me that, libraries, in particular open source libraries, are great. And then also noting the work in general was hampered due to poor access or as a result of poor access to clinicians, which meant it was difficult to appreciate their challenges and solve problems that were relevant to them. Turns out this software tool isn't used, last I heard, in the NHS in England, as clinicians have no time to do an initial screening that would be required to then use this automated pipeline. If there's no questions, I'll jump into the next sort of case study example I thought might be interesting to share, and this is geological modelling.
Sorry, Rose, there is one quick question from Jean. Did you use Qt OpenGL?
possibly behind the scenes, but interfaced directly with VTK, which I believe is built on OpenGL, so that was entirely obscured.
Oh, hopefully that
Or
answers.
something I didn't need to worry about. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Rose.
So I guess this is just another case study, as I said. Different application in this case. We've got a commercial software tool. I was a research engineer. So I guess for scale, well, jump on to the next. So Leapfrog is the primary software, sort of their application. You can see another screenshot of it here. It's written in Python, uses OpenGL. At the time I left, employed about 150 to 200 software engineers. And I was part of the much more research team, sort of like 10 to 15 across the entire business. And then company have been around in some form or another since 1995. So quite a big legacy stack and quite a lot of, I guess, sort of technical debt when I was there. So this application, the GUI framework they used was GTK+. And while I was there, they migrated to Qt, which ended up with, well, there was, one team working, maybe of like 5 engineers working on this for 1 to 2 years. I think it was 1.5 years. And then there was a 3-month period where there would have been about 100 engineers and other sort of technical people working on that migration for a 3-month period. And also in terms of the legacy stack, they had some C libraries that were created in the 90s, which gave them some of their, just jump slides, some of their kind of core, I guess they would call it sort of, point of difference, or really that the company had built its success on. So these were C++ libraries. I say C++, as they were initially written as C, and I think as the developers gained a bit more experience, they kind of moved a bit more to C++, but definitely not high quality C++ code. And really they focused on surface generation from point clouds. So you can see the figure to the left here shows, I guess if you look on you sort of see some green and yellow points. Those would be the original point cloud points. And then a key bit of their, I guess, competitive advantage came from generating those red points on the outside and the blue points on the inside. So instead of making a surface of a hand that looks like the blobby thing to the left in figure C, it instead looks like a nice smooth hand in figure B. And really a big part of that is to do with how you generate effectively these fake points. And you can see to the side here, this has at one time been a software product in its own right. Although in recent years, Leapfrog has taken ownership of that software from the various companies that it's split out into, and has really kind of hidden it away effectively to, from their view, keep their competitive advantage. But it's that I guess those algorithms that ensure you have these surfaces that geologists, at least most, or many would tell you, look nice, I guess, for geological modelling. Where that's subjective, of course. I'll spend a little bit less time talking about this case study, both being sort of aware of time, but also as they exist as a successful company, and don't want to stray into sort of areas of basically sharing anything that's viewed as a trade secret. I guess while I was there, being a research engineer from this much smaller team of off to the side of the software engineering team, we were sort of tasked with a few problems that were viewed as a little bit more maybe numerical, and two kind of areas focused on generating grids or meshes for water modeling, groundwater modeling, and really, I guess, how to have variable resolution meshes, ideally with properties that are sort of suitable quality for finite element analysis or other forms of numerical modeling. And I'd say you can sort of see sort of mixed success, especially to the right. Another avenue of work while I was there was in looking at fault uncertainty. So the first, this is commercially released and has been for probably 5 or 6 years now. And this I didn't actually check to see if it's in the software or not at this stage. This work came out of a PhD student who approached us for help basically, and the company knew that uncertainty is something that's really important to the field. I didn't really talk about users. These words span on one end from resource mining geologists, so people digging up the ground, hopefully in targeted ways to minimize the environmental impact, to extract things like lithium for our phones, computers, or electric cars, through to people searching for gold or coal, other forms of kind of resources underneath the ground at one end, through to civil engineers designing underground sort of networks like the City Rail link in Auckland or overseas. And across the board, uncertainty is important and increasingly important as tolerances reduce, or the money spent on either extracting resources or making sparse measurements under the ground. It's very expensive to drill a hole to try get a sense, and it only gives you a 1D sort of hole, I guess, line basically into the earth. So going from that to some sort of conclusion about what's under the earth, modeling that, but also including some quantification of uncertainty. So anyway, PhD student had approached us, and we thought that would be a good opportunity company thought it would be a good opportunity to wrap its head around a little bit more how one could sensibly quantify uncertainty, and also how one could visualize it, as those are two difficult challenges. So in this case, you can see Monte Carlo simulation exploring fault zones, where the fault network was parameterized, and a whole bunch of models were generated and then visualized. And I've sort of included the link to the relevant paper published using this approach. And I'll perhaps slightly abruptly wrap up that section with, again, a few sort of notes. Again, this was closed sourced software. Code migration is really hard and expensive. It's pretty phenomenal, I guess, effectively cost or effort required to migrate from WX widgets, or I've forgotten to Qt. And also, being in a much larger scale sort of group of engineers, systems are really important when collaborating, either internally or, of course, externally. The version control systems, the test suites were really well developed, but even then they weren't well enough developed. So there's a lot of effort spent improving them as the company grew from sort of 20 people when I first interacted with them before going off to do my PhD to the 150 plus when I left. And also noting, in this case, really the work done by us engineers, we were very far away from the geologists, the users of the software, and it remained a constant challenge to ascertain if we were producing something that was useful. Really hard to get useful feedback. The software still sold, but it was difficult to work out if it could have been a lot better if we tried some other option. So just a few remarks there. For my final example, I thought I'd talk about flood modelling, DEM generation, and apologies to those that have seen me speak at the New Zealand Research Software Engineering Conference the last couple of years. At least the slides are a bit new, but the content remains, in a similar vein. So this is work I've been doing at NIWA, predominantly been doing at NIWA, and really the why, the what is trying to better be able to model flooding at a national scale level. Just a quick jump through. There's lots of reasons why we should care. Flooding's increasingly common, and these are just floods, ending close to a year ago now, and we know there's been many since, including Cyclone Gabrielle. It's really expensive, frequent, increasingly frequent, and it's getting worse with climate change. And just to give, again, some background, some context here. So flood modelled inundation, or modelled flood inundation, is really important for planning, prediction and response. And what do I mean by flood inundation? Here you can see the map shows basically modelled flood depth for some event. This is usually done with 2D hydrodynamic models, or various numerical models, but 2D hydrodynamic models produce an accurate, one of the best options out there due to their accuracy. And if you're taking that approach, the result is going to be highly dependent on the digital elevation model. And then drawing it back to the project I was brought on, we aim to do this across all of Aotearoa. And so basically I was brought on to produce a system to create digital elevation models across all of New Zealand. And again, some more background. What is a digital elevation model? It's a digital representation of bare ground topography once you've removed everything from the surface. And hydrological conditioning is the process of improving the DEM to more accurately represent flow paths. You can think of that as moving surface cover, but also ensuring hydrological flow paths are accurately included. So basically, the digital elevation model is what the water sees. So that means any infrastructure that allows water to flow is included. So if you have a culvert across the road, that should be represented in some way in the digital elevation model, or at least for the model. And again, some more background data for digital elevation models. We've got things like bridges and culvert locations. We've got LiDAR data, which is it's probably the best data source out there right now for making digital elevation models, because it can be flown over a wide area. It's relatively dense and it's relatively accurate. But in some areas, you might have field grade surveys. So this might be something like elevation cross sections across a river, where someone's gone out and very accurately measured the elevation of the riverbed across a river. Depending on what LiDAR you're using, you'll only get reflections off the water surface. Red LiDAR, green LiDAR will give you some depth in water, but the water has to be clear. Got things like river networks, representation of natural features, and then also global digital elevation models, which are often 30 meters in resolution and generally generated from satellites, and they often have poorer vertical accuracy than all the other data sources we've spoken about, but they do exist everywhere. So I've been tasked to make some sort of software or framework that could take in LiDAR where existed and produce digital elevation models everywhere that could be used for hydrological, for modeling, flood modeling using hydrodynamic models. Well, it needed to be automated. Looking at what it was going to be used for, we wanted to roll it out across New Zealand, and we wanted to be able to do this automatically. So opted for a command line based solution. So no GUI here. And having had a bit of a look around the sort of tools that were available, opted to use Python as the sort of language of choice. And in this case, I had the luxury of starting from scratch and making use of both open frameworks. And here in New Zealand, we're really lucky to have a lot of open data. And that's our primary study site. It's great to be able to make use of that. So, whole wealth of sort of tools from the scientific Python community like NumPy, RealXarray, Dask, Xarray, but also other tools like GitHub Action, Forge, PyPy, and Silk as well, for being able to use this framework alongside the other tools required to perform hydrodynamic modeling. Open data as well, as I said, here in New Zealand, we're really lucky to have lots of open source spatial data, including stuff hosted by the good folks at LINS, the LINS data service, and also their point clouds and open topography, and a nod to OpenStreetMap. So, and I don't want to, harp on too much, you guys will all be well aware of the great things that you have if you've got robust software, making use of test suites, documentation. GitHub can really aid with that. And also something that was new to me coming in, people at Sequent had definitely taken care of this, but I knew and sometimes ran the test suites and knew about all the work they did to package up their tools such that they could send it off as an executable. So it's definitely been a sort of learning opportunity for me going through this project. And I guess something that we as research software engineers are really kind of in the luxurious position of potentially being a bit of a jack of all trades if we're working on smaller problems, as we often are, a 1 to 5 person team. So again, just going back to the big picture, need to have some sort of tool that basically takes predominantly LiDAR, produces these hydrologically conditioned digital elevation models. And then we need to be able to do this all across New Zealand. And that's where Silk comes in, which I won't really be speaking about any more than that. I just wanted to, and I was encouraged to show some code. I do have a demo at the end, which we may have time to run. Didn't quite figure out how to show code in a way that I thought was useful, but instead I'll use this image to kind of go through some of the stages of the application. So I showed before an architectural diagram with a bunch of different modules. Some were red, that's data, others were blue, and those are processing stages. And there's one final one that is hydrologically conditioning, and that's basically taking outputs either that you've provided or from the other processing stages and combining them to produce both a hydrologically conditioned digital elevation model, which you can see to the left, or also a second layer in an Xarray that indicates where this data came from, which is really good for data traceability and science reproducibility. And I just wanted to include a bit more information, an example of one of the stages, but looking at the time, I'll just sort of continue on. And if you've got any questions, we can always go into this in a bit more detail. So I'm going to I thought it would be interesting to have a bit of a look at performance. And I apologize to those who watched the NESI webinar that Maxine Rio kind of organized a wee while ago, but I thought it would be interesting just to emphasize, I guess, this point and something I've found really useful, I guess, using open source tools as we can really, I guess, speed up how we reduce the time to producing kind of higher quality code. So here we've got the architectural diagram again, and basically we're trying to deal with these reasonably large mid-sized data sets over quite a large region, which means you are ending up with maybe the small end of big data, maybe it's just large data, and looking at how we could improve the performance, which we did through chunking our digital elevation models and running each chunk in parallel. If we look at where these are, I've just included a few of the, so if few, I guess, indications of where we can make use of DASK for parallelizing our digital elevation models, where those are represented by X-rays. And you can see really it comes in that middle line with riverbed estimation, open and closed waterway inclusion, and unconditioned digital elevation model generation. And all of those three in common have the fact that they run effectively some unconditioned DM generation under the hood. And to give some context, I have mentioned digital elevation models a bunch. I gave a bit of a physical context to them, but we think of them maybe more in as something closer to maybe a data model, or in relation to LiDAR tiles. When LiDARs flow in, it ends up being chunked up into different files, just because it's large enough that it's required. And we want to turn those individual files that can contain scattered point data. So it's not structured, it's not like the voxel grid of a CT scan. Instead, it's just randomly scattered around. And we want to turn that into a regular grid, like the pixels in an image. So the sort of approach that you can take using DASK is to chunk up the digital elevation model you want to generate into, say, chunks of 100 by 100, figure out which of the LiDAR files fall on that, load them in, and then do whatever processing is required to produce this these individual elevations. And here I'm just showing a task graph, which DASK allows you to sort of easily generate. And if we look in detail, basically we're loading in these LiDAR files, and then we're calculating the elevation over that chunk. And just, I'm going to show a demo showing 4 different instances of using DASK to parallelize some code, where I've changed the number of workers, number of CPUs, and basically, and also the size of each of these chunks, and then also the memory limit, just so you can get a sense of the difference sort of in time required. And if you look to the lower right, basically we've got lots of workers, we've got reasonably small chunks, but we've got a low memory limit, and that's going to stall out because the memory limit's too low. If you look above, we've got quite a few workers again, a suitable memory limit, small chunks, and that one will run through fastest all the way through. And then we've got 2 others to the side where there's fewer chunks or fewer workers. And I'm going to just sort of skip on, as I'd like to just come to my concluding remarks and give plenty of time for questions and what's been a bit of a whirlwind, hopefully not too much. I guess I think hopefully the things that I wanted to come through here is, hopefully it goes without saying, version control is our friend. It's a way that we can collaborate with others. It's a way we can keep track of our own work and make sure we can constantly improve our outputs. I think it's really important to know either our users or our problem, depending if we are creating software for ourselves or for others. And where possible, we really benefit from making use of open source software, open frameworks, and open data. And finally, we're in a field that allows us to really make use of our skills for a diverse set of applications. Even if we've only worked in one kind of area, we will have skills. Basically, being a research software engineer means that we can apply those skills to other applications, even if they seem quite unlinked. Cool. I wanted to end it there.
Thank you so much, Rose. That was quite an insightful talk. And I, as a research software engineer, I can totally relate to applying your skills to a varied or diverse set of applications. And I loved that you shared examples of using, not closed source software as well as open source software and the benefits that come with it. I just wanted to, in the last 6 minutes, give anyone an opportunity to ask questions, if you want to use the raise hand gesture or reaction, so I could, and then you can unmute and ask your question, or pop it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. I'll just give everyone a minute while to do that. Where's Rose is still here?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. I think someone thought we lost you. Well, so I have a question, Rose. It seems like you've worked on a various set of applications, which requires quite different types of domain knowledge, like many research software engineers do. And so, you have to sort of grasp domain knowledge, communicate with researchers and collaborators within that domain. Do you have any specific learnings or things that you think helped you along the way in sort of bridging the gap as you work with people from different domains?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I feel like it's a ongoing journey. I think through doing a PhD in some ways, that definitely gave me a bit more confidence and a few more skills or tools in my toolbox for coming across a new field and learning enough or being able to make some sense of it without becoming an expert, because it would take forever, such that you can communicate in a sensible way with others. So I think it's about having some framework or system, internal sort of approach basically to kind of organizing the information that you kind of come across, and so that you can come back to it, because you're definitely not, in your first week going to be able to have a good idea of even what all the acronyms are, let alone what area of that field makes sense to actually invest time in. And then also being upfront and confident enough in what you're bringing to the table, basically your software and research software skills, such that you're happy either coming in and saying, look, this is what I'm contributing, but this is also the limits of my current knowledge, or sort of asking colleagues for a bit more of an explanation for some bit of their field that they think everybody knows, when actually there's a whole world out there who has no idea what this particular acronym or whatever means.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, never assume, right? So try to minimize the jargon that you use. So we do have one question from Matt, and I think yeah, and so this is a more domain specific question. Do you want to ask it, Matt?
I was just going to, domain specific, because as the people at NESI will know, I make maps and play map sports. How good? What kind of resolution can you get with your DEMs from open source, say from the open data point clouds?
Really depends on the density of the point clouds. I've made them to 1 meter from sort of some of the publicly available data sets, including one from 2013. I think that probably, off the top of my head, only has like 3 or 4 points per square meter. And I've used that not to produce a hydrologically conditioned digital elevation model, but to, for some of the processing to infer river kind of widths, basically, for inferring for estimating river beds. So really it depends on the data. I think you could definitely go sub 1 meter if you had one of those denser data sets that are more like 30 meters, 30 reflections per meter. And of course, there's also LiDAR on drones. So if you happen to have access to one of those, you could sample at a much higher resolution.
I'm going to go play. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Let me know as well if you make use of GeoFabrics, if there's any pain points you come across while installing or the like.
Yeah, well, there's an equivalent piece of software, orienteering software out of Finland, Kartapaloton, which does the vegetation density and the contour mapping at the same time.
Neat.
I'll post that in the chat.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Oh, where's chat gone?
Awesome. And while you do that, Matt, we have Gemma who has a question. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, so a number of times you mentioned communicating with end users and that you've been in a number of situations where there needed to be more communication with end users because your product didn't end up getting used, or there were requirements that you just weren't aware of or stuff like that. Do you have any examples of situations you've been in where you did have good communication, or do you have a sense of what types of systems are good for setting that communication up?
Yeah, well, I have to say now, being embedded in a science team, producing tools for those same scientists, that's just fantastic. So that's really easy. But that scale there would be challenging because I'm one person producing a tool for like 3 or 4 others in my little team. So I can get fast, direct feedback, and it's also something that is blocking them, I guess. It's something that they can, as soon as I develop the next step, they can immediately use it and see the value of it. So I think if you can be both, just have plenty of contact with the people using your software. I think, so in the clinician case, in some ways it was time that was the real limiting factor in their case, because they had very little time, since they're supposed to like spend 5 minutes or whatever screening their CT scans, and they're overworked. And this was, the NHS with a lot of like austerity related funding, reduced funding. At Sequent, there I think were 2 challenges. It certainly was better than it had been. A real challenge early on is they had no geologists, so there was a bunch of electrical engineers often, let alone not even software engineers, who really didn't have the right language. So I think shared vocabulary, and a little bit of that is upskilling yourself in the domain so that you can have sort of useful conversations where you ask the right questions with the people you're kind of creating tools for. But if you can end up with someone on your team that's a user of the tool, that really, in my experience, has aided the kind of give and take, I guess, sharing of ideas, collaboration. Hopefully that helps.
Cool. And I can see that we're at time, and I'm sure people have other commitments. So I'm just going to wrap this up and say thank you so much, Rose, for taking us through that journey and showing us various different applications and giving us a glimpse into your life as a research software engineer. And thank you, everyone, for attending our talk. And we will hopefully see you next month for another interesting talk. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Next one.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.